Everybody, as always, please turn off your cell phones, please. I really appreciate that. Wisdom Wednesday, OLLI members and guests are invited to attend Wisdom Wednesday presentation 2:30 to 4 right here on this stage, and that will be by Richard Guther, I believe. Will present Auburn University campus development efforts. So that's, I guess that'd be fun. Annual meeting is Monday, May 20th in the Fellowship Hall, Auburn Church of Christ. OLLI member art fair is from 9 to 10, and then the meeting is from 10 to 11. And artists see the flyer by the sign-in table for more information. So if you're an artist, you know, personally all I can draw is flies, but that'd be me. So with that said, it's time to start class. So, you may remember last week we played Stump the Lecturer, and indeed I was stumped by the question. And the question was, how many people worked at Oak Ridge? And the fact of the matter is, in 1945 there were 75,000 people. It was then called the Clinton Engineering Works. It was not referred to as Oak Ridge. It was run by the U.S. Army under the Manhattan Project, and the person in charge was General Leslie Groves. Well, that got me thinking, what about what was going on in Hanford where we were making plutonium? So I decided to look that up. So I always kind of learn something when I'm in these classes. So when you do ask me a question, sometimes I get more information myself. Well, at Hanford in 1944, and by the way, that's the B reactor. That was the first reactor built to make plutonium. At that reactor, there were 44,900 people building the Hanford facility in 1944. Now, from what I understand, the town where they lived in was a pretty rough place. It was hard to get good help, let's put it that way, during that time of the war. And the area they lived in, it was full of crime, drinking, prostitution. You name it, it was going on. It was bad there. But that's what you got in the middle of nowhere in Washington State. Well, also they had, and I can't find out exactly how many people were there during the war, but where the administrators and the engineers and people like that lived was this other town called Richland Village, and by the end of it there were 4,300 family units and 25 dormitories. So I would assume that was probably, the place kept expanding even after the war. So I don't know the exact number, but regardless, the United States could afford to have maybe 150,000 people working on the atomic bomb in the middle of World War II. Nobody else could afford to do that. That's incredibly a large number of people to take out of building tanks and guns and things like that and put into a project that was basically, they hoped it works. It's more of a science project, like I say, than it was actually a real event. But we could afford to do that. Well, I also found something else out. As you may remember from the last lecture, the core of the plutonium bomb, the Fat Man bomb, was the size of a small orange, and it weighed 14 pounds. Well, the Hanford facility in its 40 years of operation created 57 tons of plutonium. So my assumption is we are never going to run out of plutonium in our lifetime. I think we have plenty of it. So I think that's an amazing amount of plutonium to produce out of that facility. One other note today is, because today is actually May 1st in Japan, the new emperor of Japan will be assume the throne, the chrysanthemum throne. His name is Naruhito. His father Akihito resigned yesterday, which is unusual for emperors. They don't usually resign, but he decided he was getting too old and couldn't maintain the duties. And of course, Akihito was Hirohito's son. So it's a big day in Japan today with the ascension of the emperor.
The New York Times has a very nice in-depth article on it today.
On Akihito?
On the chrysanthemum throne and World War II and the passage and all sorts of
Okay. Did everybody hear that? There's an article in the New York Times today covering this and the emperor and the Japanese in general, I guess. Okay? All right. So, what are we talking about today? We're talking about kamikazes. Yes?
I wondered if there was the same degree of security at Hanford and Oak Ridge.
Oh, absolutely.
That's a lot of people to keep quiet.
Yep. Yeah, you were locked in. It was barbed wire. You weren't allowed to just go partying around. It wasn't as tough as Los Alamos. The question was how much was security there? There was a lot of security in both places, but not to the level of Los Alamos, where Los Alamos, the security was incredibly tough. You couldn't tell people even you were there. I think I'm having a feedback thing. Here we go. But anyway, so the term kamikaze means divine wind, and that's in regards to, as we talked about in the first class, the Kublai Khan invasions that were both destroyed by typhoons, giant storms that wrecked the fleet of Kublai Khan, and so consequently Japan was never invaded. We also talked about a little bit what the samurai class and the Bushido code, that is the way of the warrior, it is honor, it is duty, and it is basically never surrender. Honor can only be regained by seppuku, or is pejoratively referred to as hara-kiri. So in other words, ritual suicide to regain your honor if you lose it. And like hara-kiri, the term kamikaze is believed to have actually derived from U.S. Nisei Japanese that were born here and that were translators, and they actually came up with the term kamikaze. The term that is more proper to use in Japan is the term shinpu and tokotai. And tokotai means special attack. Frequently, it's just referred to as toko. This is the Yasukuni Shrine in Japan. The Yasukuni Shrine is equivalent to our version of any of our major military cemeteries. Arlington probably comes to mind most. And this is where all Japanese war dead are enshrined. During the post-war period, the United States Army intended to demolish Yasukuni and build a dog track on the site. The Catholic Church, which has a relatively large presence in Japan, particularly unfortunately in Nagasaki, they intervened and basically said, how would you feel if the Japanese had won and decided to bulldoze Arlington Cemetery and build a dog track on the site? And the powers that be of the U.S. administration did indeed back off and left the site alone, and it does exist today. So, as you may remember from the first class, we talked about the Satsuma Rebellion, where Saigo Takamori had led the samurais in a revolt against the Meiji Restoration government. They were soundly defeated by the conscription army of the Japanese, peasant army in effect, that had been now drafted and become soldiers. And they had soundly defeated the samurai because they outnumbered them, and it's easier to use a gun than a sword. And the thing with Saigo is he chose to commit seppuku rather than surrender, and that set a goal that his ideals were more important than his life. And the Japanese government, and Meiji in particular, later on actually pardoned him, so he was given as an example of how a warrior should really be. He never was, though, enshrined in Yasukuni because he was a rebel. The victory of the conscription army over the samurai just reinforced the thinking that all Japanese men now were samurai, not just samurai class. Emperor Meiji begins to send out rescripts, what is the expectation of what your people will do. And the military rescript says simply that duty is more weighty than a mountain, death is no heavier than a feather, and consequently the support of the emperor and support of the state with your life is the most important thing there is. He then begins to send out rescripts on education. And the education rescript is also very, very important. And the same idea in 1890 is when that came out, is that you are to, it's like the Pledge of Allegiance in effect. Every day Japanese children would say that they have to courageously, give themselves to the state, and the ultimate offering for those people was to defend the emperor, to defend the state with your life, and it was in fact an honor to die for the emperor and the state. Well, unfortunately, this is where Ensign Ogawa did end up, the gentleman we saw on the first slide. He crashed into the Bunker Hill along with another pilot, kamikaze pilot, and they caused, as you can see, significant amounts of damage, 389 dead. So, and that smiling young man ends up giving his life for his country. It's what he believed in, and indeed he was extremely successful in that. So, the Japanese military thought that by doing these things, by committing acts where they would literally have no chance of surviving, that they would end up becoming guardian spirits of the country. Many Japanese felt that to be enshrined at Yasukuni was incredibly important because that was the one place where common men could become deified. And indeed, the emperor, twice a year, would go to Yasukuni and pay homage to the war dead. So this has got extreme religious aspects for the Shinto religion. So again, earliest age, from childhood, you are indoctrinated to these beliefs after 1890 and the Meiji Restoration. Remember, this is not previously. The emperor before and during the Tokugawa time period was indeed more just a religious figure. Now he has become more entwined with the state. And we also talked briefly about how the fact that there was the organ theory, where that he is the head of the state, not the state itself. Of course, if you were a believer in the organ theory, you were putting yourself at great risk of being assassinated. So this is very, very important to the Japanese military that the emperor had such an exalted position. So when I was a kid, and I'd read about kamikazes and this kind of stuff, I've always been interested in it, I was informed incorrectly that the people that made kamikaze attacks were drunk or drugged. They were locked into their cockpits, and they were only given enough fuel to make a one-way trip. That is not true. The Japanese military used kamikazes as an asset. They were not drunk, drugged, or anything. They did this on their own volition. They weren't necessarily thrilled by it, but indeed they did do that. And they were always given enough fuel to return, and many, many did. So if they didn't find a target, again, these people are an asset. And the military of Japan sees them as an asset. And so they don't want them wasting their lives uselessly. They want them to make hits on U.S. ships. That's what this is about. So, and they begin to use kamikazes as a way to get rid of unconditional surrender and make a more palatable outcome to the end of the war. Well, the kamikaze does become a military tactic, and this is part of the reason. As we see on this map, this green is the Philippines. If the U.S. takes the Philippines, particularly the island of Luzon, which is the big island there, they will now cut off the Japanese ability to ship supplies to Japan from the southern resource area, which is one of the biggest reasons, if not the biggest reason, that they went into this war. They needed to get oil, tin, and rubber. That all comes from Borneo and Indonesia. So if we take the Philippines, they can no longer ship any product back to Japan from what they took. So they come up with this Operation Shogo. It's a desperate attempt on their part to try to stop this. And what they're going to do is they're going to use their aircraft carriers, not as aircraft carriers, but as bait. So they're going to use them as bait to lure our carriers north and away from the Philippines. And then they are going to send their battleship force through the Philippines, the middle of the islands, and try to destroy our invasion fleet off of Leyte. Well, as you may remember, at the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the famous battle where we destroyed Japanese carrier aviation, they no longer have the capability to have any sort of carrier fleet that's effective because there's no planes available really, and they know their planes and their pilots, etc., are not good enough to go in and attack our carriers and get hits. So they come up with another idea. And the first organized naval, this is always an argument, but the first really organized naval assault on our carrier groups is actually here, where we have small groups of TOCO units, and they go in, and these are pretty good pilots, and they're flying Zeros with a single bomb on them, and they sink a couple of small escort carriers and destroy and damage severely several other escort carriers. So the original TOCO attacks do take place in the Philippines, but this isn't really well organized at this point. So they see this as being the only possibility that they have that they're indeed going to be able to make us lose ships. Our defenses are just too good for conventional attacks. Well, the plan with the battleships fails. They sail back to Japan in defeat, and the Philippines are lost. So with the Philippines being lost, the Japanese government now realizes that indeed the war is lost. They don't really have an opportunity any longer to win the war in a manner which they thought. Their navy is destroyed, the land-based air power can cut the seas, and importantly, as you may remember, one of the major reasons that they got into the war in the first place was they assumed that Germany was going to beat Russia and was going to beat Britain and would preoccupy the United States so much that the United States would back off and let them do whatever they wanted in Asia. Well, Germany's on the ropes by this time in '44. So they can see that what they referred to originally in 1940 as the golden opportunity to take Asia is indeed not happening. So things are just getting worse and worse for Japan. They think that they can get a negotiated peace, but the only way they could possibly get a negotiated peace is by one big victory, and they use kamikazes as the thinking that that's what they will do to achieve that victory. So when we think about kamikazes, you see this aircraft is just about to hit, I believe it hits the Essex, that TOCO attacks were primarily aircraft. And there's actually numerous types of kamikazes. Of course, we translate the word kamikaze to divine wind, so it kind of reinforces the whole aspect that these are airplanes. But there's lots of kinds of kamikazes. So even before the Philippines, the Japanese knew that they, particularly after the Marianas Turkey Shoot, that they couldn't get in and get hits. They couldn't get in and attack our aircraft carriers. Our defenses were just too strong. And lower level, I would say, Japanese officers are beginning to come up with a plan to have TOCO attacks and beginning to come up with ideas how these TOCO attacks can be made and what kind of materials you will need to make these TOCO attacks. So there's very, very limited chance of survival for these people with some of these things that are coming up with, but the Japanese High Command says originally, well, you know, we can't make these kind of weapons where people are just automatically going to die. So you have to build an escape plan into these weapons. But it seems, as we'll see, that this was pretty marginal, and in fact, there was no reality to this. The Japanese government eventually just comes to the point where it doesn't really matter any longer. We're just going to expend these people as weapons. And the first one we'll talk about is this guy. And this is referred to as an Oka. Many people in the US will refer to this as a Baka bomb. Baka, by the way, in Japanese means stupid. So it's, again, it's a US name, it's pejorative, and it was probably come up by the Nisi. But what this thing is a world's really first truly smart bomb. Now you can argue about this and say, well, hey, you know, the Germans had the Fritz X, you know, and it was used in 43. Okay, well the Fritz X, the way it worked, it was a glide bomb. It was dropped from an aircraft. It had a flare in the tail, and what you would do is you would have a radio controller, like a little joystick, and you would follow that bomb down but you had to keep it in sight. You couldn't lose sight of it. And then you would try to steer it into a warship. That's how that bomb. We had a similar weapon too. It also used a flare in the tail. And we also had B-17s, old B-17s that were used with TV cameras. Again, there was a visual piece there. But I really think that the Oka was the first truly smart bomb because it was a fire and forget weapon. So in other words, once you dropped the Oka from the plane carrying it, you didn't need to follow it anymore. It had guidance. It had a pilot. So it's carried into battle by the venerable Betty bomber. For those of you in my last class may remember, the Betty was a twin-engine long-range bomber that could also carry a torpedo. They would remove the doors, the bomb bay doors, and sling a torpedo underneath it. Well, they could do the same thing with this. They could use this same aircraft to carry the Oka, and the Oka pilot would actually fly in the plane until he got close to the target. He has to get within 20 miles. And he would then get in the plane, they would drop him, and when they sighted the targets, and he would then go into his final dive. So it's a pretty potent weapon if you think about it. It's got a 20-mile range. It goes 600 miles an hour. It carries a 2,600-pound warhead. Its biggest problem was the carrying aircraft. The Betty bomber was old and slow, and you couldn't get a Betty bomber within 20 miles of a U.S. carrier group and expect that Betty to survive because it wasn't gonna. So we had so many fighter aircraft in the air, the Betty couldn't get within 20 miles of a U.S. carrier to attack it. So that's kind of why it was going. Now, I'm going to ask Mike here, if Mike would help us out. Mike, being a former high-speed aviation guy, if I was going to bail out of this thing at 600 miles an hour without an ejection seat, how would I do?
It's not going to happen.
So, you're basically saying that, indeed, you're not going to get out of this thing.
That's basically what I'm saying.
Yeah, so you're going to be, so basically you're writing this thing down. Well, thank you for assisting me with that, with your knowledge of high-speed aviation. Mike was a F-4 Phantom pilot, so he would understand that. Yes?
Did they have parachutes? Did they give them parachutes?
Oh, no. You're not going to waste it. No, there was no way to get out of this thing. I mean, really, let's think this through. All right, you're in the middle. I'm going to bail out at 600 miles an hour. If by some chance I survived that, even if I had a parachute, which you wouldn't, I'm in the middle of the ocean. Is anybody going to come save me? I don't think so. So, no, they were intending to ride these down all the way. And the Japanese government had to make it seem like that this was okay, but there was no way you were surviving one of these things. So, those of you that may remember the Bell X-1 with Chuck Yeager being dropped out of the bottom of a B-29, or when I was a kid, I was really fascinated by the X-15 program. You can see that the Betty dropping an Oka is very similar to that idea. It would carry a thing in its belly like a torpedo and let it go. But again, couldn't survive to get close. It's just impossible. All right, other types of kamikazes. So you may remember that the Japanese had the best torpedo in the world. It was called the Long Lance. And two junior officers decided that what we could do is we could take the Long Lance and make it a little bit bigger, a little longer, and we could put a control unit in that, make it a little tiny submarine. And the Japanese government, the military said, well, that's okay, but you got to make an escape hatch. Well, what they did was they made an escape hatch in the bottom theoretically, but again, you're underwater, you're going 40 miles an hour, you're on a terminal run into a U.S. ship, and somehow you're going to come out the bottom of this thing, and of course now you're in the middle of the ocean again, so it's really crazy. But it was an interesting idea to take something that they already had that was quite effective and then modify it. So you can't really get out this thing. But what they did with that escape hatch is they turned that escape hatch into an asset, because now they would mount these on the deck of submarines. The chiton pilots could get into the chiton from underwater through that escape hatch, which now is not an escape hatch, but it's actually an entryway, and then could be launched underwater to keep the submarine safe. They built 400 of these. 100 were actually used in a sense. Not 100 were launched, but 100 were actually taken out on patrols. If you didn't see an enemy ship or it wasn't capable of, or your submarine was destroyed before you actually had a chance to be launched, which frequently happened, then indeed you didn't launch. But I mean, they did sink 2 U.S. ships using this thing. Now, if you'd like to see one of these, if you go to the Bowfin Submarine Museum in Oahu, Hawaii at Pearl Harbor, you can indeed see a Model 4. Now, Model 4 is much larger, and it was made to have a little more range. They only built a couple of these. And it could be launched from underwater on a submarine, or it could be launched from land. They would roll it out and basically push it in the water off a little train track. So, yes, one pilot. So it's a smart weapon. It's got a pilot in it. So, and his job is it's a one-way ride. You're not surviving it, okay? So, in fact, one of the U.S. ships that was sunk, which is interesting, I think, it was called the Underwood. It was a destroyer escort, and it saw what they thought was a midget submarine, and they decided to ram it. Well, obviously, ramming a chiton is a bad idea. They also had this guy, the Kairu. It was a 2-man midget submarine. It's a much more capable weapon, really, because it has 2 conventional torpedoes. It also has a 1,300-pound warhead for a TOCO attack. Mostly important, it has a 450-mile range surfaced and a 40-mile range beneath the water. So it's a much more capable weapon. And they were going to build 700 of these. By war's end, they managed to build 213. And they were primarily going to be used to defend Tokyo Bay. Then they made this guy, the Maru-Ni or a Shinyo, depending on if it was the Army or the Navy. They both made these. They made 9,000 of these. And what these were designed to do is be like a little tiny motorboat, and they would put a couple of depth charges in the front of it, and you would crash this thing into the side of, not a warship, but a transport, and then detonate the 2 depth charges and, of course, do severe damage to it. Then they had the Fukuyu, which I think is the craziest of all of these. And what the idea of this was is they were frogmen wearing underwater breathing apparatus. They were to be underwater at the time of an invasion. They were to be in little concrete bunkers, and then they were to emerge from these concrete bunkers underwater with a pole mine and then thrust that into the side of a landing craft. Now, Maybe when you were a kid and you were a bad kid like I was, you used to throw silver salutes into water to see if you could get fish to come up. Or if you were in the army, you would throw hand grenades in the water and get yourself some free fish. My suspicion is if you're in a beach being shelled and you're in the water in one of these little bunkers with all that concussion going off, you're going to end up being like one of those fish because you're going to get tremendous amount of concussion underwater. And you're not, even if these, don't get the idea that these little these underwater bunkers were sealed. They weren't. They were just a little bunker. They're still underwater. You're not in a contained environment. So I think that the concussion alone would have killed these people. So yeah, it was crazy in my opinion, but they did that.
Frank, what sort of underwater breathing device did they have?
Oh, they had a rebreather, not like a scuba tank.
A rebreather?
Yeah, a rebreather. Yeah, early like you would have seen it. We had similar stuff to escape submarines. Did everybody hear that? What kind of underwater breathing apparatus they had? And they had a thing called a rebreather, not like modern scuba tanks. You can look it up on Google. Anyway, so, I'm sorry?
Is that a smart pole? Smart pole.
Yeah, that was a smartphone. Yeah, I don't think so. But anyway, Geretsu were kind of like, not paratroops, but they were designed to crash land aircraft, transport aircraft onto U.S. airfields and then jump out and raise as much havoc, destroy planes, kill pilots and guys as much as... And actually there were a few Geretsu attacks during the war that were sort of effective. Not particularly, but it certainly caused a lot of consternation on the airbase when all of a sudden a bunch of Japanese jump out and start shooting up the place. So the air guys were pretty woke them up for the day, that's for sure. And then they had numerous types of anti-tank units, and I'm really not making this up. They would literally dig a hole in the middle of a road and cover it over, and they'd put a guy in there with a 250-pound aviation bomb and a rock. And when the tank went over, he would hit the rock on the detonator and, of course, blow up the tank in himself. So, all right, so the kamikazes in action. The U.S. decides to invade Okinawa, which is close to the coast of Japan. And this is so we have tactical air power close to Japan so we can A, isolate Japan from the coast of China and Korea, and also the fact that they can begin to plan to invade Japan. There are 10 of these massive kamikaze attacks. The first one, Kokusai 1, consisted of 215 Navy aircraft, 82 Army planes. It was launched on April 6, 1945. And it also included the battleship Yamato, the battleship Yamato, the cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers. And the idea of that was they were to sail to Okinawa, they were to beach themselves on Okinawa, they were to use their main guns to destroy the U.S. landing, and then their Navy personnel was to get out of the ships and attack on land. Needless to say, they do not get within 100 miles of Okinawa before they're sunk by U.S. air power, except for 4 of the destroyers do get back to Japan, carrying as many survivors as possible. So the largest battleship in the world, Yamato, is indeed sunk off of Okinawa. They have 10 of these, like I said. It's the best effort the Japanese have to try to destroy this invasion. The thinking is that they will destroy the U.S. Navy off the coast, and then our troops will be isolated on Okinawa, and then they will be able to defeat our troops, expecting us to surrender. Well, that doesn't really happen. We beat back the kamikazes. It's bad, but we do. And after Okinawa, they have to come up with now another plan. So those Kakusai, 940 naval, 887 aircraft from the Army. That's 2,000 total, 258 aircraft. Remember, they had escort fighters and Bettys carrying the Okas, so there's more losses than just, you know, the kamikazes themselves. And they lose a total of 3,067 airmen. They score 133 hits on U.S. ships, 122 near misses. They sink 36 Allied warships. 218 are damaged. They kill 4,900 U.S. sailors and wound 4,824. The kamikaze is by far the most effective weapon the Japanese produced during World War II. I've listed here 47 or 57 warships sunk, 400 damaged. Why is it 47 or 57? Because military historians like to argue about stupid stuff. And one of the stupid things they like to argue about is, well, if a ship is so badly damaged by a kamikaze that we decide to abandon it, and then we sink it with our own torpedoes or shell fire, was it sunk by a kamikaze or was it sunk by us? And they like to argue about this stuff. So you might as well just say it's 57. So that'd be my thinking. Anyway, this causes a lot of problems with the U.S. fleet because the sailors are, I wouldn't say terrified, but they're certainly unhappy about the fact that this is going on, that the enemy is so intent on killing them that they're going to kill themselves. And it begins to cause a lot of combat fatigue amongst U.S. sailors, and it also creates an immense amount of hatred for the Japanese as an enemy, that they are just, that this is totally unacceptable behavior. And it causes major changes in how we project power with our aircraft carriers. So what we have to do is we have to keep those kamikazes a long way away from our fleet. Well, in order to do that, we start taking more and more bombers off our carriers and putting more and more fighters on those carriers. And so now the carriers are not as much, don't have as much combat projection power as they would have because they're now carrying so many fighters in order to destroy the kamikazes. So it really changes a lot of issues with our fleet as well. And they refer to this as the big blue blanket. Navy planes were blue. And so the big blue blanket is a huge fighter screen to keep those Japanese kamikazes away from the carriers and the rest of the fleet. That brings us to probably one of the more disturbing aspects of this. And this is referred to by the Japanese, by the way, as 100 million die as one. And you can see from this picture that that is a Japanese civilian jumping off what is known as Marpi Point in Saipan. And the way this goes down is the Japanese don't want to lose Saipan because Saipan is part of the empire since the end of World War I. There are actually 22,000 roughly Japanese citizens that live on Saipan. So this is the first time in the war where there's actually an indigenous Japanese population that is going to be under attack by the U.S. So the U.S. indeed takes Saipan, and on July 19th, the Japanese newspapers say that all members of the Saipan meet a heroic death, and the remaining civilians appear to share their fate. But they don't really know what happened on Saipan. They have no way to know it because, again, communications are lost when the battle degenerates. Well, 1 month later, all of a sudden, Saipan is back in the news in Japan. And the main paper in Tokyo, the Asahi Shimbun, states, sublimely, women too commit suicide on rocks in front of rising sun flag. Patriotic essence astounds the world. So what causes this? How did this totally change for the Japanese? Well, it changed because of a Robert Sherrod article in Time magazine that he wrote on August 7th, in which he describes the events that occurred on Marpy Point, where these people were so terrified of U.S. occupation, they were so afraid, the government had basically told them that the Marines were going to rape and kill and eat their grandmother for, you know, anything they could come up with to make this be like a terrible event. And they don't really know, though, that the U.S. had actually taken over 10,000 Japanese civilians, surrendered, and were treated very well, and actually went out and tried to stop other Japanese people from jumping off Marpy Point. Now imagine this, with whole families are walking to the edge of that cliff, and they've been terrorized and they jump off to kill themselves rather than be captured by the U.S. Also, some of those people get to the edge, women, children, and they think, you know, this isn't a good idea. I can't do this. I cannot jump off this cliff. And they begin to walk back. When they do that, they are shot down by Japanese troops that are still in the area. So, they are totally convinced that they will not be treated well, and they begin to do these things. Now the Japanese government, what it does is it begins to change the Sherrod story. So they've used the Sherrod story where Sherrod describes the fact that we took 10,000 Japanese into custody. They do not do that. They tell the Japanese people that indeed every single Japanese citizen on that island jumped off that cliff. The total numbers of people that actually did jump off that cliff are probably around 1,000, which is still horrendous, but it's certainly not 22,000. So they are trying to get the Japanese people to fight to the death so that they can get a negotiated peace. And Sherrod wrote this. He goes, "Do the suicides on Saipan mean the whole Japanese race will choose death before surrender? Perhaps that is what the Japanese and their strange propagandists would like us to believe." Because again, Sherrod knows that not all the Japanese committed suicide. Well, the Japanese government has turned this around, and that's what they want the U.S. people to ask. Will indeed the Japanese, will they fight to the death? But what they also want is they want their own people to believe that these have set an example for them, and this is how their behavior should be indeed in the future if we invade Japan. And again, this is all designed to prevent unconditional surrender of the Japanese government and the military. So you can see that this behavior has really forged the attitudes of how this war will continue on for another year. So it's become a fight to the death, and the Japanese government is the people that are promoting this to be a fight to the death. The emperor goes so far as to promise the people on Saipan that if indeed they commit seppuku, if they resist the U.S., that they will become guardian spirits of the empire in an equivalency to Yasukuni. They're not to be enshrined in Yasukuni, but they will achieve this status after life. And he broadcast this to them. So remember this. The Japanese are not keeping this a secret. They're telling the world that they're going to be 100 million die as one. They are going to fight to the death. And this is what Marpy Point looks like today in 2019. You can see from the size of the people on the top there on the top left that you're not going to survive jumping off that cliff. The other thing interesting, if you go there today, is the entire area is covered with Japanese monuments to the people that died there. And so the Japanese have come to the realization that this was indeed a tragedy. So it's a very, having just been there, it's a very, very sad place, really. All right, why don't we take a short break? Hey, we almost ready?
Ready.
Come on, gang, help me out here. I got a lot to cover and I'm running out of time. Okay. Operation Downfall. Well, Operation Downfall is the U.S. and with British naval assistance, not land, naval assistance only. That was a decision by the U.S. that they didn't want British troops on Japan. It would be too much of a logistics problem, that's what they said. I'm not sure if that's true, but that's what they said. And what we're going to do is we're going to invade Japan. Well, and there's Japan. So, but first, why are we going to invade Japan? Well, because of our war aims. And at the Casablanca Conference in '43, we decided that the Axis powers would have to have something called unconditional surrender. There's always this story about Truman, it just popped into his head and that kind of stuff. That is a story. It didn't, or not Truman, Roosevelt. It didn't just pop into Roosevelt's head. This was planned, but it made for a good story. And what they want to do is they want all the Axis powers to unconditionally surrender their military and their governments. It is designed to prevent what the Germans referred to as the stab in the back. The Germans claimed, particularly Hitler, by the way, it is the anniversary of Hitler's death today. So congratulations. Thank you, Mr. Barber. And he said that the reason Germany lost World War I was because Jews and communists stabbed them in the back at home, and the German army was never defeated in the field. Indeed, it wasn't their fault they lost. They were lost because of the home front. Jews and communists caused the loss of World War I. Well, the Allies in World War II are decided that this isn't going to happen again. They're not going to allow this. They're going to demand unconditional surrender, so what we can do is impose democratic governments on these nations. And if we impose democratic government on these nations, that indeed that will prevent future wars. Because democracies in their mind don't really go to war for aggressive reasons. So that's what they said. So, and if you think about it, the fact that we imposed democracy on Japan and Germany for 75 years now, almost 74, none of those countries have been at war with us. So there's something to be said about the fact that they needed to impose democratic government on these countries. Well, Roosevelt clarifies this message to the people, okay? Because it seems like you can, and certainly the propaganda the Germans used, the Japanese used, that indeed that if they had unconditional surrender, we were going to, particularly the Japanese said that we were going to rape and kill and destroy the entire country. Well, as early as '43, you see that Roosevelt says, we mean no harm to the common people of the Axis nations, but we do mean to impose punishment and retribution upon their guilty and barbaric leaders. So he has separated the population from their leadership in our goals for unconditional surrender as early as '43. Well, later on in the Quebec Conference, there's other thought processes. So they didn't think they were going to be an invasion of Japan until 1947 or 1948. Well, at this conference, they come up with, and it's August of '43, they decide that 1 year after the defeat of Germany, they will defeat Japan because they feel, Joint Chiefs of Staff feels that the people of England and the U.S., their morale will deteriorate so badly if we let the war drag on that they will not be able to impose democratic governments through the unconditional surrender methodology. I'm going to get there. Just give me a second. We're going to have fun with that. Okay. I picked this picture for a reason. So, all right. So the Navy, the U.S. Navy, still wants to follow what was known as War Plan Orange, and I think I briefly mentioned that previously. And that was the idea where you marched across the Pacific and took islands, all within tactical air power range. But the main idea was that you would surround Japan, you would starve them, basically, of natural resources, and they would then submit to defeat. They would surrender because of blockade. The Navy never, ever, ever in the previous 50 years, well, no, like 45 years, that they came up with these plans to defeat Japan, never intended for the U.S. to ever invade the Japanese homeland. They never thought that was a good idea. So the question needs to be asked at this point is morale more important than casualties? And I think we have a simple answer for that. But now, as to this picture, at the Quebec conference, it ran, I think, like about 6 days. And on the last day, they decided to bring in this gentleman here on the left, who you asked who he was. His name is Mackenzie King. He is the Prime Minister of Canada. And they brought him in on the last day primarily just to have a photo op, because they were having this in Canada and they felt, well, you know, we've excluded him from all the conferences. Maybe we better bring him in on the last day so we can feel like at least he had something to do with our strategy in the war. But, I mean, I'm not making that up. They literally brought him in on the last day to take a picture. So, anyway, Mackenzie King, he died in 1950. If anybody wants to look him up, you can Google him. So, all right, so what is our plan? Japan is a mountainous country. It doesn't have a lot of good roads. It doesn't have a lot of good beaches, considering it's an island nation. Very few areas in Japan are suitable for an invasion. Transportation is primarily through a thing called the Inland Sea, and we'll talk about that more next week when we talk about some of the things that were going on as far as attacking Japan proper. And also by limited railroads. There are very, very few good roads in Japan at this time. So almost everything is either by rail or by ship in Japan in the 1940s. And we're going to attack the island of Kyushu, and that will be called Operation Olympic. The U.S. Navy, following War Plan Orange, originally wanted to take and have an invasion of the mainland of China, again to surround Japan and to blockade it. The Chinese army is so weak, and if you took my last class last fall, you may remember the last Japanese offensive, major offensive in the war was indeed in China and pretty much knocked them out of the war. So the Army says the Chinese army is so weak, there'd be no help to us. We would just be opening up a can of worms. We're not going to invade the Chinese coast. So they decide to pass on that. So we always are trying to attack the Japanese within range of tactical air power. Again, that's War Plan Orange modified from the fact that we used to use coal. Now it's modified to the distance of tactical air power. So we always do this, except for a couple of occasions. The first occasion really would be Peleliu. Peleliu is out in the middle of the ocean. It's 700 miles from anything. And there were no other bases within range, but we had enough carrier air power to take Peleliu. The other good example, I think, is really Iwo Jima. Again, Iwo Jima is too far away from any U.S. base at the time to be used with tactical air power, but again, we could surround it with carriers and knock it out. But that's a big difference between attacking two little islands, particularly Iwo Jima is only 4 square miles, and attacking the Japanese mainland. That's a much bigger thing to attack. So once we captured Okinawa, and you can see that here, here's Okinawa, this black circle, we were going to invade Kyushu, the southernmost major island in Japan. And that's the reason is that Okinawa is 350 miles from Kyushu. So it's well within tactical range. The other part of this plan, the second part, Operation Coronet, was to attack Tokyo. But that's over 700 miles away from Okinawa, so we can't get there with tactical air power. But that's really where they want to go. They want to go to the Tokyo area, which is called the Kanto Plain. So they're going to attack Kyushu first. And so Operation Olympic, that's the attack on Kyushu, would have been the largest invasion in history at that time. It would have been larger than Normandy, where we landed 7 divisions. We would have landed 11 divisions for a total of 770,000 men in the initial deployment. That's a huge amount of people. It was scheduled for November 1st of 1945, and it was the first phase of the total operation, which is known as Downfall.
Frank, on that map,
Yes?
back up one please.
Yep.
Where is Iwo Jima? Where would Iwo Jima be on that map?
Right there.
Okay, where is Saipan and Tinian?
Right there.
Okay, thank you.
Got it?
Got it.
Got it. Okay. The question was, where was Iwo Jima and where was Saipan and Tinian? And I didn't make that up. So just so you know, Iwo is right here, and Saipan is right there. So you can see B-29s can make it because it's a very long-range aircraft, but tactical air power cannot make that kind of a distance.
Where's Nagasaki? Where's Nagasaki?
There.
Oh, so it's on Kyushu.
Yeah, it's right by Kyushu. It's right there. It's right by that gap there. And then Hiroshima is pretty much right over here. Okay? I'll show you that on, next week. We'll get there next week. Okay, so anyway, so then the major part of this whole thing is called Operation Coronet. That is the invasion of Honshu. That is the main Japanese island with most population, where Tokyo is. That is a gigantic operation. And that was going to take place in May 1st of 1946, I believe. It was to capture the Kanto Plain. That's one of the few areas in Japan that we could use armored forces because it's not mountainous. Hence why the Japanese population was so large there as well. And again, it has landing beaches that are usable. Now, it was March 1st of 46 was when they were going to do Coronet. This thing was big. They were going to land 20 infantry divisions, 3 marine divisions, 2 armored divisions, a total of 1.2 million men landing in this invasion, and not to count the Navy and the Air Force and all the other units involved. So this is huge. Well, the assumption for the Kyushu invasion is that they're not going to take the whole island. They're only going to go to approximately here. This is roughly where they were going to go to. They only needed the southern part of the island because, again, this whole thing was about air bases. They estimated that the Japanese would have 3 divisions in the north, 3 divisions in the south, down here, and we were going to land, like I said, almost 800,000 troops, and so they would have a very good margin of more than 3 to 1. Eventually, they figured the Japanese would be able to bring in 350,000 total troops to our 800,000, but not the initial landing. It would take them a while to do that. They thought that there would be 2,500 aircraft to oppose us, but the wild card was, again, the fanatically hostile population of Japan. Remember, they have been told over and over and over again that 100 million will die as one. That's not a secret. The expected time of the operation is 90 to 120 days. The expectation is that we will have 23,000 casualties in the first 30 days and a total of 105,000 at completion. That's U.S. casualties. Well, the Japanese have an idea, and they call it Ketsugo, which is called Operation Decisive. They're not stupid. They know how we operate. They know that we always operate within range of tactical air power whenever possible. And they decide that the next place that we will attack will indeed be Kyushu. And what are they going to do? Well, they're going to make this invasion so costly, so ugly, that the United States people will basically tell the government that we need to have a negotiated peace with Japan. This has become unacceptable. It's going to be much too costly to defeat Japan to a level where they would accept unconditional surrender. The Japanese military, their actually biggest fear at this point in the war is that we won't invade. They actually want us to invade, because if we blockade Japan and starve them out, they are afraid that the Japanese people over time, that they will succumb to propaganda and they will begin to overthrow the Japanese government. And most frightening to them is they will go after the kokutai, as we talked about, the national polity, the position of the emperor. So they are terrified by this. They are wanting us to attack Japan. I know that sounds crazy, but that's what they want. So what are they going to do? Remember, we thought they were going to have 6 divisions there. They are going to bring 14 divisions onto the island of Kyushu. They thought we'd have 2,500 aircraft to oppose us. They're going to use 10,000 aircraft in kamikaze attacks. They're going to literally take all their trainers. They're going to take everything they have, and they're going to try to defeat us. But they're not going to attack our carriers. They're going to attack our transport ships. They're going to try to hit softer, easier targets. It's much easier to sink a transport with limited gunpowder than it is to sink a warship. And interesting, because these trainer aircraft, some of them are fabric biplanes, they're not particularly sensitive to our radar, and they're not particularly sensitive to our proximity shells, which are so effective in destroying Japanese aircraft that have a little radar in the fuse of the shell. When it gets close to a plane, it blows up. Well, these planes are so basically non-radar reflective that those shells aren't particularly effective, and a group of these little biplanes actually sinks a U.S. destroyer. The U.S. is very, very unhappy with that. And we are just really way underestimating what the Japanese are capable of doing at this point. So the other issue is that they are not going to be able flying over water all the way to Okinawa. They're going to be hugging the land to get underneath our radar and blind us. And so the big blue blanket will be much less effective against these kinds of tactics. So again, the other thing is they don't have to look for us because they know where our landing is. So if we land on this, by Rock Bay in Kyushu, they fly there because they know that's where our transport ships will be. So there's not like any searching going on. There's no hiding. So they're also going to use 47 submarines, mostly carrying Kitons, 393 midget submarines, a big bunch of those motor torpedo boats, those little Maroonese, and they're going to try the suicide frogmen. They're going to do everything they possibly can to destroy this invasion. They're also going to use a completely different set of tactics. They're going to have their units not on the beach, but behind the beach, fixed units that don't have a lot of mobility. And then they're going to bring in counterattack units to try to destroy the beachhead. They also do something that I think is immoral at best. And they create a thing called the Patriotic Citizens Corps. All men 15 to 60 and all women 17 to 40, even though they have no uniforms, they have no real weaponry, they are expected to fight. If you think this through, if I'm a U.S. soldier and I'm walking through a Japanese village and I pass a few 16, 17-year-old girls. And we walk by them, and then one of those girls gets up and stabs one of my friends in the back with whatever, a pitchfork or whatever they can get their hands on. What is my reaction going to be when I get to the next town? I am not going to be, I'm not going to be able to trust these people as being civilians, because in effect, they're not behaving like civilians. They have no uniforms, they don't have regular weapons. But they also have another factor that is easily overlooked in this regard, besides the straight-out military one. What they will do is they will be able to take over many logistics, digging trenches, etc., for the regular Japanese military, making every single man in a Japanese division available to be a combat soldier. So everybody should know that a percentage of combat soldiers is actually relatively small compared to the size of a U.S. division. Well, with all these citizens now taking those functions over, indeed it creates much more combat power for an individual Japanese division. And the 5th Air Force, because the Japanese are broadcasting this, it's not a secret, decides that they will issue an edict that every single person on Japan, there are no civilians. That's directly from the 5th Air Force. So you're looking at 1.2 million of these people that are being mobilized by the Japanese government. They go so far as April of '45 to close all their schools so school children and their teachers can take part in the war effort. Well, Operation Olympic is now becoming in question, and the reason it's becoming in question is really the fact that we have tremendous decryption capability. We're breaking their codes. By this time, we are reading 1 million Japanese Army messages a month. We know every single thing they're doing. That's not counting how many diplomatic messages we're reading. That's not counting how many Navy messages we're reading. We're reading 1 million Army messages a month at this time. That's how good our code breakers are. And we find out that the Japanese are going to have 550,000 people on Kyushu. Well, actually, they're going to have 900,000 on Kyushu when you count everybody, not just the Army, not the civilians. So the Army still wants to invade, but then we start looking around for other places they could invade. Maybe we could just go to the west side of Honshu. Maybe we could go to Shikoku. Maybe we could go here and there. But nothing really matches up to our needs for tactical air power. So they're really getting at a conundrum here. So you may remember I said we would have a ratio of 3-to-1 attackers to defenders at the key point. At this point, the Japanese military is actually going to outnumber the U.S. invaders. This is not a plan for success. The Japanese have also come to the conclusion that the biggest single thing that we have better than the Japanese Army is our tanks. The Sherman tank at the beginning of the war is much, much better than any Japanese tank available until they come up with the Type 3 Chunee. The Type 3 Chunee is a very effective tank. It's at least equivalent to a Sherman. The interesting thing with this, though, is during the entire war, they were built very late in the war, they managed to build 60 of these. We managed to build 40,000 Shermans. So they have to find a way to destroy our tanks. And what they are going to do, of course, is they're going to use suicide tactics. They have some improved anti-tank guns, and they would go out at night and they would sneak out and put landmines in the road and then sneak back in. Particularly on Iwo Jima, they did this significantly amount. And they were planning on doing the same thing. And on Okinawa, they destroyed 57% of our tanks. So, key figures from Okinawa, and we're going to talk about casualties now. Remember, the original number was 23,000 at the 30-day mark, and then 105,000 for the total campaign. But when we look at Okinawa, against 75,000 Japanese and 25,000 armed civilian Okinawans, the U.S. suffered 72,000 casualties, 12,510 dead. So in a 120-day battle, versus 900,000 Japanese versus 1 million Japanese civilians, how many people would we lose? The number is going to be significantly higher than what the original estimates were. And a conservative estimate by Rich Frank from the book Downfall for Japanese dead is 580,000. So we're looking at a much expanded problem here. So Willoughby, who is MacArthur's intelligence chief, starts rehashing the numbers. And he comes up with the fact that in order to reach the stop line, that's, remember, the final part of Kyushu where they were going to stop, they would have 280,000 casualties. But when you put in all the services and you put in psychiatric casualties and everything that's possible, they are now taking it up to potentially up to 500,000 US casualties just to take Kyushu. Well, post-war, many revisionist historians have used these original numbers of 23,000 and 105,000 and the projections for all these casualties as being much lower than when Truman and other US politicians say that by not invading Japan and using the bomb, we perhaps saved 1 million American casualties. Well, they take those original figures and say, well, see, how could that possibly be? So that's just a lie. It's just an excuse for the fact that we used the bomb. But the fact of the matter is, when you really analyze this and you see what the casualties were on Okinawa, and then you look at how, what the damage is here for 10,000 kamikazes, 900,000 troops, those numbers, the original numbers for invasion of Kyushu were a joke. So it really takes that whole piece about that we inflated the numbers as justification for using the bomb. Well, the Army goes so far, because this thing isn't working out, is they're going, well, why don't we use some of those plutonium bombs? We'll just drop them on the beachheads, and then 48 hours we'll just march in and we won't have to worry about anything. Well, of course, at this time, they don't realize how much radiation issues that would be in 48 hours. So they don't really have a good idea. They never really have a good idea of what they've got with the atomic bomb until we actually start to use it. That's a key thing here. You'll see that in the next couple of weeks, too. The prospects for Olympic are becoming so bad that Nimitz, who's the commander of the Pacific, and his boss, Admiral King, are beginning to think that this is such a bad idea that they need to withdraw Navy support from this entire invasion. And there's letters to this effect, where they're talking about the fact that this thing is going so bad that maybe we shouldn't even do it. Lastly here, Marshall, with the Army, even after we've dropped 2 atomic bombs, still thinks that maybe we should still invade Japan if they don't surrender immediately. What they don't think about, in fact, is that Harry Truman was an artillery officer in World War I. He served overseas. He fought in World War I. So he understands quite a bit about casualties and problems. So there's a real situation there as far as that goes with he, and this is my opinion. My opinion is that Harry Truman never would have allowed this invasion to go forth at the way it was going, into that kind of teeth of Japanese opposition. So, for the invasion of Japan in 1945, we made 500,000 Purple Hearts for that invasion. After Korea, Vietnam, the first Desert Storm, the second invasion of Iraq, we still, by 2003, still had 120,000 of those medals unused. My suspicion is, and I'm pretty confident of this, is that we're still using them today. We still haven't exhausted that supply from 1945. So you can imagine how terrible this really would have been for our POWs. The Japanese were going to exterminate our POWs. They were not going to allow them to be taken back. And the fact that there was mass starvation going on throughout Asia caused by the Japanese occupation. So when you think about the deaths, loss of Japanese citizens, U.S. soldiers, U.S. POWs, international POWs, and the Asian population in general, it's just a really good thing the war came to an end as quickly as it did. With that said, I'll either take 2.5 minutes of questions or we can have a review. Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering if during this planning for this invasion and all, if anybody consulted with General Curtis LeMay, because as I understand it, his solution to win a war was to burn down all the cities with firebombs.
Well, we'll get to that next week.
Almost did it in Tokyo in 2 nights.
We're going to talk about all that next week. The question is would LeMay have beaten the Japanese with just firebombing? And indeed, we will go through that in great detail next week. Yes, sir.
In the plans you went over from both the American and Japanese perspective, did the Russians figure into any of this? I know that they were afraid of communism, but...
The question is where do the Russians fit into this? Again, we will discuss that in great detail on the last session of this class 2 weeks from now. So you're all jumping ahead on me. But, well, good. Yes, ma'am.
With all the pilots dying as kamikazes, how do they keep supplying new ones to keep flying? Because isn't there a training curve involved?
The question is...
I mean, obviously you don't fly that well if all you're going to do is crashes, but you still got to get the...
Okay, the question is did they have a pipeline for pilots if they were going to have all these pilots doing kamikaze attacks? The fact of the matter is they were going to expend everything to stop the invasion. So there was no need. In fact, they were taking all their training aircraft and going to use their training aircraft for kamikazes as well. And remember, they were getting very short on fuel. So this was there was nothing going to be held back. There was no need for a future at all.
They're just going to use it.
They were just going to use everything. Anyone else? Well, I think we're done. Oh, one more. Bobby.
When was the B-29 first used against Japan?
When was
the B-29 first used?
Oh, when was the first B-29 first used? The B-29 was first used from, we'll talk about that soon too. The B-29 was first used from India to China and then to bomb Kyushu, because that's as far as it could go. It could only go to the southernmost island, and that was in November, I believe, of 1944. All right, well, thank you so much for coming, and I'll hopefully see you all next week.